The year was 1653, Westminster Palace, London. The long chamber of the House of Commons buzzed like a disturbed hive. The air was heavy and stale, saturated with the acrid smells of hundreds of unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, wax from guttering candles, and an old, almost palpable animosity. Beyond the high Gothic windows, the capricious April day shifted from rare sun to pouring rain, but here in the heart of English power, a far more terrible storm was brewing. For more than 10 years, this room had been the main stage where the nation's fate was decided. Here, fiery, hours-long speeches that could change history had been delivered. Here, laws that shook the foundations of the European order had been forged. Here, in this very hall, the death sentence had been passed on God's anointed, King Charles I. But today, all of that would come to an end. In the center of the hall, clad in a simple black woolen doublet, without a fashionable wig or lace cuffs, stood a man with a rough, weathered face, on which a look of grim determination was fixed. His eyes, usually pensive and heavy, now burned with a cold, steely fire. This was Oliver Cromwell, Lord General of the new States Army, victor over kings, a man whose name had already become a legend to some and a curse to others. He listened to the parliamentarians' debates, and with each passing minute, his face grew darker. He saw before him not the fathers of the nation, not pious men, but a gathering of self-serving politicians, lawyers, and merchants, clinging to a power they had long ceased to deserve. They had betrayed the Revolution. They had betrayed God, and he, Oliver Cromwell, was here to be the instrument of divine wrath. Suddenly, he took a step forward. The buzzing in the hall fell silent. Hundreds of heads turned towards him. The silence was shattered by his sharp, booming voice, accustomed to giving orders on battlefields, drowning out the roar of cannon fire. "Enough!" he snarled. "I will put an end to your prating." With these words, he snatched the hat from his head and began to pace the hall, unleashing a torrent of furious, searing accusations upon the stunned members. He branded them for their drunkenness and debauchery, for their nepotism and injustice, for their endless delays and greed, for turning God's great cause into a pathetic farce. "You are no more Christians than my horse," he shouted, and in his voice was not just anger but the deepest contempt. Then his gaze fell upon the massive speaker's chair and the ceremonial mace lying before it, the ancient symbol of Parliament's power and authority. Cromwell's face contorted in disgust. "What shall we do with this bauble?" he roared, pointing at it. "Here, take away this fool's bauble." At the doors, the grenadiers of his personal regiment had already appeared, muscular veterans in red coats who had been through fire and water with him from Marston Moor to Worcester. The members of Parliament, who just recently had decided the fate of England, were frozen in their seats in horror. History, holding its breath, watched as one man, guided only by his own will and unshakable faith, dispersed the oldest representative body in Europe. On that day, the Republic died to give way to the rule of one man. But who was this man? A holy warrior or a bloody tyrant? A liberator of the nation or its usurper? To understand this, we must go back in time to the misty and turbulent era that gave birth to the greatest schism in English history, and to the quiet countryside where, far from the splendor of the court, a boy was growing up who was destined to execute a king and himself become an uncrowned monarch. His name was Oliver Cromwell. Oliver. Before we turn to the life of our protagonist, it is necessary to paint a canvas of the era, upon which his figure will emerge in all its tragic and majestic complexity. Early 17th century England was a time of the deepest tectonic contradictions, hidden beneath a deceptive veil of peace and prosperity. A new dynasty, the Stuarts, who had come from wild and proud Scotland, sat on the throne, and its very first representative, James I, brought with him ideas that were profoundly alien to English political tradition. England, unlike the powerful continental monarchies like Spain or France, had never known absolutism in its pure form. Since the Magna Carta, signed under pressure from the barons back in 1215, the idea that the king's power was not limitless had taken root in the country. It was constrained by law and the rights of subjects, represented in Parliament. Parliament consisting of the House of Lords, where the hereditary aristocracy and high clergy sat, and the House of Commons, to which representatives of the gentry, the so-called landed gentry, and wealthy townspeople were elected, had one key, unshakable right to approve taxes. The king could rule, wage war, appoint ministers, but as soon as he needed money beyond his regular income from crown lands and customs, he was forced to summon Parliament and negotiate. This financial dependence of the crown on Parliament was the cornerstone of English liberty and, as it turned out, the main source of future conflicts. James I and then his son Charles I saw things completely differently. James, the son of the tragic Mary, Queen of Scots, was an experienced Scottish monarch who had written a whole treatise on the divine right of kings. He and his son sincerely believed that their power was given to them directly by God, and they were accountable only to him. Parliament, in their eyes, was not a partner in governing the state, but merely an annoying obstacle, a relic of the feudal past that should either be subordinated to their will or abolished altogether. Charles I, who ascended the throne in 1625, was a man of a completely different stamp than his father. If James was clumsy, talkative, and not averse to coarse manners, Charles was a refined aesthete, a connoisseur of painting who amassed one of the finest art collections in Europe. He was an exemplary family man, a deeply religious person with impeccable manners. But as a politician, he was a disaster. Proud, stubborn, secretive, and utterly incapable of compromise, he considered any disagreement with his will a personal insult and a sign of rebellion. His reign from the very beginning turned into a protracted struggle with Parliament over two key issues: money and religion. The religious landscape of England at that time was like a minefield. After the Reformation of Henry VIII, who broke with Rome for personal and political rather than theological reasons, the Anglican Church became the official church. It was a peculiar hybrid, retaining many Catholic rites, liturgy, and the hierarchy of bishops headed by the Archbishop of Canterbury, but rejecting the authority of the Pope. However, a powerful movement was gaining strength in the country, striving for a deeper purification of the Church from what they considered popish remnants. They were called Puritans. Puritanism was not a single doctrine. It was a broad spectrum of beliefs united by a common idea: the necessity of building one's life, the church structure, and the state itself in strict accordance with the Word of God as set out in the Bible. The Puritans rejected lavish ceremonies, icons, stained glass, expensive vestments for priests, and the authority of bishops. They preached the strictest morality, hard work, modesty in life, and the personal responsibility of every individual before God. For them, the Bible was not just a holy book, but a comprehensive instruction manual for daily life. At the core of their worldview lay the stern doctrine of John Calvin on predestination, the idea that God, even before the creation of the world, had chosen some people, the saints, for salvation, and others for eternal damnation. It was impossible to know one's fate, but a sign of being chosen was worldly success achieved through honest labor, a righteous life, and a deep, sincere faith. This worldview formed a special type of personality: energetic, disciplined, purposeful, absolutely confident in his own righteousness and ready to do anything to defend his faith. Charles I and his closest advisor in church matters, Archbishop of Canterbury William Laud, saw Puritanism as a direct threat to order and royal authority. For if priests and bishops were not necessary for the salvation of the soul, then why was their hierarchy, headed by the king himself, needed? Laud began to carry out reforms aimed at unifying the church service, reintroducing elements that Puritans considered idolatry. Altars were moved to the East End and separated by an altar rail. Organ music and kneeling at communion were introduced. For thousands of Englishmen, this was not just a matter of ritual. It was the advance of the Antichrist, a creeping Catholic restoration. Suspicions were aggravated by the fact that Charles's wife, the French Princess Henrietta Maria, was a devout Catholic and openly kept Catholic priests at court. Throughout the country, from London to the most remote villages, in the hearts of thousands of people, merchants, artisans, farmers, and most importantly, many of the gentry, a sullen discontent was growing. They saw the king trampling on their ancient rights, trying to rule without parliament, and imposing on them a foreign, popish faith. The atmosphere was thickening. England stood on the brink of an explosion, and it was in this environment, in the very heart of Puritan England, that Oliver Cromwell was destined to grow up and rise. And while thunderclouds were gathering over the capital, in the quiet and marshy region of eastern England known as the Fens, a measured life went on. On April 25th, 1599, in the town of Huntingdon, a boy was born to the family of Robert Cromwell and Elizabeth Stewart, who was named Oliver. His origin was modest but respectable. He belonged to the gentry class, the minor landed nobility that formed the backbone of provincial England. These men did not possess the titles and vast fortunes of the lords, but they were independent, owned land, served as justices of the peace, sat on juries, and, most importantly, were elected to the House of Commons. They were the backbone of local government and the conduits of public opinion. The Cromwell family had once been quite influential. Oliver's great-great-grandfather, a Welshman named Morgan ap William, had made an advantageous marriage to the sister of Thomas Cromwell, the powerful and ruthless minister of King Henry VIII, the architect of the English Reformation. It was Thomas Cromwell who oversaw the dissolution of the monasteries, and his relatives, having changed their Welsh surname to the prestigious name of their patron, grew fabulously wealthy on these former church lands. However, by the time of Oliver's birth, the family's luster had faded. His father was a second son, inheriting only a small estate that brought in a modest but stable income of £300 a year. Oliver's childhood was much like that of thousands of other boys of his class. He received his primary education at the local grammar school in Huntingdon, under the Puritan preacher Thomas Beard. There he memorized Latin, studied ancient history through the works of Plutarch, and, of course, daily pored over the Holy Scripture. The Bible, especially the Old Testament with its stern stories of prophets, judges, and warriors leading God's people, became his lifelong companion. He grew into a strong, physically well-developed youth who loved riding, hunting, and rough male pastimes. Contemporaries described him as impetuous, quick-tempered, and prone to fits of deep melancholy, which he himself called musing. A great inner strength hidden beneath a simple and rough exterior was already discernible in him. In 1616, the 17-year-old Oliver entered Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge. The choice was not accidental. This college was known as one of the main centers of Puritan thought in all of England, and it was here that Cromwell's worldview was definitively formed. He was not a brilliant student and studied there for only a year. His father's death in June 1617 forced him to return home to, as the only adult male in the family, take over the management of affairs and care for his mother and sisters. He was only 18. For the next few years, he probably spent time in London studying law at one of the Inns of Court, which was a necessary stage for any gentleman wishing to engage in public affairs and manage an estate. In 1620, an important event occurred in his life. He married Elizabeth Bourchier, the daughter of a wealthy London leather merchant with strong ties to Puritan circles. This marriage was not only a love match. All evidence points to a deep and lasting affection between the spouses throughout their long life together, but also an advantageous one, strengthening his social and financial position. In the following years they had 9 children, and Cromwell immersed himself in the life of an ordinary country squire. He managed his farm, participated in local affairs, and raised his children. It seemed his destiny was predetermined, to live a quiet, unremarkable life, like his father and grandfather. However, storms were raging in the depths of his soul. In the late 1620s, Cromwell experienced a profound spiritual crisis. He later described this time as a period of darkness and despair. He felt himself the chief of sinners. He was tormented by depression, hypochondria, and the fear of eternal damnation. He even consulted doctors complaining of imaginary illnesses. He sought solace in the Bible and prayer, and at some point around 1630, what the Puritans called conversion or being born again happened to him. He felt that God had forgiven him, that his sins were washed away by the blood of Christ, and that he was chosen for salvation. This experience changed him completely. Melancholy gave way to an unshakable, almost fanatical confidence. He came to believe that he was henceforth an instrument in the hands of Providence, and that all his actions, all his successes and failures were directed by the will of the Almighty. This conviction would become the source of his incredible energy, determination, and at times ruthlessness. He ceased to be just a man. He became an instrument of God. The world around him did not yet know what a formidable force had awakened in this unassuming gentleman from Huntingdon. While Cromwell was finding his faith, the country was sinking deeper into a political crisis. In 1628, when the conflict between Charles I and Parliament reached its peak, new elections were held in England, and Oliver Cromwell, a 30-year-old squire virtually unknown outside his county, was elected Member of Parliament for his native Huntingdon. It was his first step onto the great political stage. The Parliament of 1628 was one of the most turbulent in English history. The members, outraged by the king's autocracy, he had collected forced loans and imprisoned dissenters without trial, passed the famous Petition of Right. This document, drafted by the eminent jurist Sir Edward Coke, reaffirmed the basic liberties of Englishmen: the illegality of taxes without parliamentary consent, the inadmissibility of arrest without cause shown, and a ban on the quartering of troops in private homes. Cromwell was an inconspicuous figure in this session. He made only one, but very characteristic speech. He attacked not the king's policy, but a certain bishop who, in his opinion, preached flat popery. Even then, it was clear that for Cromwell, religious issues were inseparable from political ones. In his eyes, the struggle for parliamentary liberties was part of a great struggle for the true faith against the forces of Antichrist. Charles I was forced to approve the Petition of Right, but soon found a way to circumvent it. In 1629, tired of the obstinacy of the House of Commons, he dissolved Parliament and began a period of so-called 11 years' tyranny or personal rule. This was a time when the king tried to rule as an absolute monarch. To replenish the treasury, he resorted to long-forgotten feudal levies, fined nobles who had not attended his coronation for knighthood, sold monopolies, and expanded the boundaries of royal forests to fine people for using them. The most hated tax was ship money. Previously, this tax was levied only on coastal towns, for the needs of the navy during wartime. Charles, however, in peacetime extended it to the entire country. This caused mass outrage, as it was a direct violation of the Petition of Right. For Cromwell, these 11 years were a time of return to private life. But this life was not peaceful. Due to property disputes, he was forced to sell his estate in Huntingdon and move to the nearby town of St. Ives, where he rented a farm. His social status declined. He effectively ceased to be a landowner and became a tenant farmer. However, it was during this period that he acquired a reputation as a defender of the common people. He led a protest of local peasants against a project to drain the marshes known as the Fens. This project was supported by wealthy landlords and the Crown, but it deprived thousands of poor people of their traditional lands for grazing, fishing, and cutting peat. Cromwell was not afraid to conflict with the powerful, and this earned him the nickname Lord of the Fens and immense popularity among the common folk. In 1636, fortune smiled on him again. He received a rich inheritance from his maternal uncle and moved to the city of Ely, becoming a wealthy man and one of the main collectors of church tithes in the region. But all these years, he, like many other Puritans, watched the events in the country with anxiety. Archbishop Laud's religious policy became increasingly harsh. Puritan preachers were deprived of their livings, their books were burned, and they themselves were subjected to humiliating punishments. Put in the pillory, their ears cut off, it seemed that England was inexorably moving towards tyranny and popery. Many in despair left for America, founding colonies in New England. According to some reports, Cromwell himself considered emigrating, but Providence had a different fate in store for him. The spark that ignited the powder keg came from Scotland. In 1637, Charles I and Laud tried to introduce a new liturgy based on the English model into the Scottish Presbyterian Church. The Scots, who cherished their stern faith even more than the English, saw this as a declaration of war. When the first attempt was made to hold a service with the new book in the main cathedral of Edinburgh, a riot broke out, legendarily started by a market woman named Jenny Geddes throwing a stool. A rebellion flared up throughout Scotland. Tens of thousands of people signed the National Covenant, vowing to defend their faith to the last drop of blood. To suppress the rebellion, Charles I needed an army, and for an army he needed money. After an 11-year hiatus, he had no choice but to summon Parliament again. In April 1640, the so-called Short Parliament opened. Oliver Cromwell was again elected as a member, this time for Cambridge. He went to London not as a novice, but as a mature 40-year-old man, hardened by life's hardships, with unshakable faith in his heart and a reputation as a fighter for justice. He did not yet know that this session would be merely a prologue to the great drama in which he was destined to play the leading role. The peace the king had so long waited for did not materialize. The short parliament lasted only 3 weeks. Instead of voting taxes for the war with the Scots, the House of Commons, led by experienced leaders like John Pym and John Hampden, inundated the king with grievances about the 11 years of tyranny. The enraged Charles dissolved this parliament as well, but his position was desperate. Having gathered a poorly trained and unwilling army, he suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Scots in the so-called Second Bishops' War. The Scottish army invaded the northern counties of England, occupied Newcastle, and demanded that the king pay a huge indemnity of £850 a day until a final settlement. There was no money in the treasury. In November 1640, Charles, gritting his teeth, summoned a new parliament. This assembly was destined to go down in history as the Long Parliament. It would last, in one form or another, for almost 20 years and would change England forever. Oliver Cromwell was again among its members. This time he did not intend to remain silent. One of the royalist members, Sir Philip Warwick, left a vivid description of his appearance at that time. "I saw a gentleman very ordinarily apparelled. His linen was plain and not very clean. His hat was without a hatband. His sword stuck close to his side. He was very much hearkened unto, but spoke with a warmth, and his temper seemed fiery." Cromwell threw himself into the work. He became one of the most active members of Parliament, sitting on numerous committees. His speeches were passionate, at times incoherent, but always filled with sincere indignation against tyranny and popery. He was one of those called root and branch men, who demanded not just reform but the complete abolition of the episcopal system in the church. The first 2 years of the Long Parliament were a time of triumph for the opposition. Parliament secured the arrest and subsequent execution of the king's most hated advisers, the Earl of Strafford and Archbishop Laud. All illegal taxes, including ship money, were abolished. The Triennial Act was passed, obliging the king to summon Parliament at least once every 3 years, and a law was passed according to which Parliament could not be dissolved without its own consent. It seemed that the revolution would be bloodless. But Charles III had no intention of giving up. He was just biding his time for a comeback. The tension reached its peak in the autumn of 1641, when a brutal rebellion of Catholics against English and Scottish Protestant settlers broke out in Ireland. Horrific rumors of a massacre of tens of thousands of Protestants spread throughout England. The numbers were greatly exaggerated, but that didn't matter. Panic and anti-Catholic hysteria gripped the country. Parliament was ready to raise an army to suppress the rebellion. But a key question arose: who would command this army? The king, by tradition, was the commander-in-chief. But could the House of Commons entrust an army to a monarch whom it suspected of colluding with the Irish rebels and of intending to use this army against Parliament itself? The opposition leaders, led by Pym, took a radical step. They drafted the Grand Remonstrance, a long list of over 200 points, detailing all the abuses of royal power since the beginning of Charles's reign. This was no longer just a bill. It was an appeal to the people over the king's head. After a fierce debate that lasted late into the night, the remonstrance was passed by a narrow majority of only 11 votes. When one member asked Cromwell what he would have done if the document had failed, he reportedly replied, "I would have sold all I had the next morning and never have seen England more." Charles's response was a desperate and reckless act. On January 4th, 1642, he personally came to the House of Commons, accompanied by 400 armed soldiers, to arrest 5 of its leaders, including Pym and Hampden. But they had been warned and had managed to escape by boat on the Thames. The king entered the chamber, sat in the speaker's chair, and not finding his enemies, uttered the famous phrase, "I see the birds are flown." This act was an unheard-of breach of parliamentary privilege. It destroyed the last bridges. London was in turmoil. The citizens rose to defend Parliament. The king was forced to flee the capital to the north, where he began to gather his supporters, the Cavaliers. Parliament in turn began to form its own army of supporters, the Roundheads, so named for the Puritan fashion of short haircuts. In August 1642, Charles I raised his royal standard at Nottingham. It was a formal declaration of war. The English Civil War had begun. Oliver Cromwell, now 43 and with no military experience, immediately went to his native county with his own money. He formed a cavalry troop from his Puritan neighbors. He acted with astonishing energy and determination. While others argued and hesitated, he acted. He seized the arsenal of Cambridge Castle and intercepted a consignment of silver plate that the colleges were sending to the king. He understood that this was not a war for political privileges, but a holy war. And to win it, he needed not mercenaries or aristocrats, but men who knew what they were fighting for. In one of his letters, he formulated his creed. "I had rather have a plain russet-coated captain that knows what he fights for and loves what he knows, than that which you call a gentleman and is nothing else." This was a simple but revolutionary idea, destined to create the most formidable army in Europe and to elevate its creator to the pinnacle of power. The first phase of the war brought no decisive success to either side. The parliamentary army, though more numerous and better funded, as it controlled London and the wealthy southeast, suffered from serious shortcomings. It was commanded by aristocrats like the Earl of Essex and the Earl of Manchester, who waged war sluggishly and indecisively. They did not seek a complete victory over the king, but hoped for a compromise that would preserve both the monarch and their own privileges. The soldiers were poorly trained and lacked morale. The first major battle at Edgehill in October 1642 ended in a draw. Cromwell, who participated in the battle as a captain, witnessed firsthand the crushing superiority of the royalist cavalry. It was commanded by the charismatic and daring nephew of the king, Prince Rupert of the Rhine. His cavaliers swept everything before them, but after the first successful charge, they scattered to plunder the baggage train, losing control and formation. Cromwell learned quickly. He understood that the key to victory was a disciplined and ideologically motivated cavalry. Returning to eastern England, he set about creating his own regiment with renewed energy. He selected men not by their birth but by their religious zeal and combat qualities. His soldiers were yeomen, that is, free peasants, farmers and artisans, common people convinced Puritans who saw the war as a struggle of Christ's army against the forces of Antichrist. He introduced iron discipline in his regiment. Drunkenness, gambling, and blasphemy were mercilessly punished. But at the same time, he treated his soldiers with paternal care, knew many by name, and prayed with them. Before battle, his regiment sang psalms. These warriors, clad in cuirasses and helmets, fanatically devoted to their commander, were soon nicknamed the Ironsides. Cromwell's talent as a cavalry commander quickly became apparent. His Ironsides repeatedly routed royalist detachments in minor skirmishes. He developed a new tactic. Unlike Prince Rupert's cavalry, Cromwell trained his horsemen to immediately regroup after a charge, maintain formation, and deliver a second crushing blow to the flanks or rear of the enemy infantry. This discipline and control made his cavalry the decisive force on the battlefield. The finest hour for Cromwell and his Ironsides came on July 2nd, 1644, at the Battle of Marston Moor, the largest battle of the war. The parliamentary army, having joined with its Scottish allies, clashed with the royalist forces under Prince Rupert. Cromwell commanded the cavalry on the left flank. At the very beginning of the battle, he was wounded in the neck, but after hastily dressing the wound, he returned to the fray. His charge crushed the royalist cavalry facing him. Then, instead of pursuing the fugitives, he performed his signature maneuver. He wheeled his squadrons around and struck the rear of the royalist infantry, which at that time was successfully pressing the center of the parliamentary army. This blow decided the outcome of the battle. The victory was complete. The north of England fell into parliamentary hands. The name of Oliver Cromwell resounded throughout the country. It is said that Prince Rupert, after the battle, gave Cromwell the nickname Old Ironsides. Despite this triumph, the overall situation remained uncertain. In the south, the commander of the parliamentary army, the Earl of Manchester, Cromwell's immediate superior, acted passively and missed several opportunities to crush the king's army. Cromwell, who by then had become a lieutenant general, openly accused him in Parliament of being unwilling to bring the war to a victorious conclusion. "If we fight on in this way, the war may last for 20 years, he declared. A fierce debate erupted in Parliament. Cromwell and his supporters, the so-called War Party, demanded a radical reorganization of the army. They understood that to win, a unified professional national army was needed, subordinate to a central command and created on the model of Cromwell's regiments. The result of this struggle was the passage of two revolutionary acts. The first was the Self-Denying Ordinance, according to which all members of Parliament, both Lords and Commons, were to resign their military commissions. The aim was to remove indecisive aristocratic politicians from the army. The second was the creation of the new model army. This was the first regular army in English history, maintained on a permanent salary from the state. Sir Thomas Fairfax, a brave and capable general, was appointed its commander-in-chief, and Oliver Cromwell, for whom a special exception was made from the self-denying ordinance due to his indispensable military talents, was appointed commander of all cavalry. The creation of the new model army was a turning point in the war. It numbered 22,000 men, infantrymen dressed in red coats, which would later become traditional for the British Army, and cavalrymen. But its main strength was its spirit. Puritan preachers maintained the highest morale among the soldiers, convincing them that they were warriors of the Lord. The army became not just a military force, but also a most powerful political and religious corporation, welded by a common ideology and devotion to its commanders. And soon this army was to face its greatest test. The decisive battle of the First Civil War took place on June 14th, 1645, near the village of Naseby in central England. The new model army, under the command of Fairfax and Cromwell, met the last major army of King Charles. The forces were roughly equal, about 10,000 to 12,000 men on each side. The battle unfolded according to a now familiar, almost tragic scenario for the Royalists. On the right flank, Prince Rupert's cavalry, as at Marston Moor, charged and overran the parliamentary cavalry facing it under Cromwell's son-in-law, Henry Ireton. And as always, Rupert, carried away by the pursuit, rushed towards the enemy's baggage train, taking himself out of the battle for a long time. On the other flank, Cromwell with his Ironsides charged the Royalist cavalry and, after a stubborn fight, put them to flight. But unlike Rupert, he did not pursue the enemy. Leaving a small detachment to complete the rout, he wheeled his main forces around and fell upon the flank and rear of the Royalist infantry. The Royalist infantry, veterans of many battles, fought with desperate courage but found themselves in a pincer. From the front they were attacked by Fairfax's disciplined infantry, and from the flank and rear by Cromwell's cavalry. Seeing his infantry perishing, Charles I tried to lead his last reserve in a charge, but one of his attendants, a Scottish lord, seized the king's horse by the bridle and led him from the field, saving his life with the words, "Will you go upon your death?" This decided the outcome of the battle. The Royalist infantry was surrounded and almost completely destroyed or captured. The victory at Naseby was absolute. The king's army effectively ceased to exist. More importantly, Charles's personal baggage fell into the hands of the parliamentarians, and in it, his secret correspondence. From it, it became clear that he had been negotiating with Catholic powers in Europe and even with Irish rebels, asking them for help in the war against his own people. For the Puritans, this was the final proof of his treachery. Trust in the king was completely undermined. Over the next year, the new model army methodically cleared the remaining pockets of Royalist resistance. In May 1646, Charles I, realizing the cause was lost, fled from besieged Oxford and surrendered to the Scottish army in England. The First Civil War was over, but victory brought new, even more complex problems. What to do with the king? How to arrange the future of England? The victors immediately split. The majority in Parliament, the so-called Presbyterians, sought a compromise. They wanted to disband the army, which seemed to them too radical and expensive, restore Charles to the throne with limited powers, and establish a Presbyterian church system in England on the Scottish model, with a national synod and a strict hierarchy. The army was categorically opposed to this. The soldiers and officers who had shed their blood for freedom were not going to exchange the tyranny of a king for the tyranny of presbyters. In the army, the positions of the independents, who advocated for the independence of each church congregation, were strong. They stood for broad religious toleration for all Protestants, of course. Moreover, an even more radical movement had arisen in the army's ranks, the Levelers. They demanded not just religious but also political democracy, universal male suffrage, the abolition of the House of Lords, and the proclamation of popular sovereignty. Their leader was the charismatic publicist John Lilburne. Cromwell found himself in a difficult position. As a member of Parliament, he had to obey its decisions. As Lieutenant General of the Army, he was one of the soldiers and shared many of their beliefs. He tried to be a mediator between the Army and Parliament, but the gulf between them was widening. When Parliament voted to disband the Army without paying several months' back pay, the soldiers' patience snapped. In June 1647, the Army mutinied. A cavalry detachment seized King Charles from the parliamentary commissioners, effectively taking him hostage. The Army marched on London, and Cromwell, after some hesitation, made his choice. He left Westminster and joined his soldiers. From then on, the Army became the main political force in the country. In the autumn of 1647, the famous Putney debates took place in a church in a London suburb. Between the Army grandees, that is, the senior officers, including Cromwell and his son-in-law Henry Ireton, and representatives of the soldiers, the leveller agitators. It was a unique moment in history. Common soldiers argued on equal terms with their generals about the future constitution of the state. The levelers presented their draft constitution, the agreement of the people based on ideas of universal equality and human rights. Cromwell and Ireton, though sympathizing with many of the ideas, considered them too radical and dangerous to the sacred right of property. The debates reached a stalemate, but they showed how far the revolution had gone. And while the victors were arguing, the captive king was not wasting his time. He was conducting secret negotiations with all scenes simultaneously, with Parliament, with the Army grandees, and most importantly with the Scots. In December 1647, he concluded a secret treaty with the Scottish commissioners. He promised to establish Presbyterianism in England for 3 years in exchange for military aid. In the spring of 1648, Royalist uprisings broke out all over England, and a Scottish army invaded the north. The Second Civil War had begun. For the army and for Cromwell, this was a betrayal. They had been negotiating with the king, trying to find a compromise, and all the while he was, behind their backs, starting a new war. In their eyes, Charles Stuart had ceased to be a misguided monarch. He had become a man of blood, guilty of the deaths of thousands. Before setting out for the war, the army officers held a prayer meeting at which they swore that if God granted them victory, they would call Charles Stuart, that man of blood, to an account for the blood he had shed. The Second War was short but fierce. Cromwell, at the head of his veterans, made a swift march north and, at the Battle of Preston in August 1648, utterly routed the numerically superior Scottish army. By autumn, all the uprisings had been suppressed. The army returned to London victorious, but now it was determined to see the matter through to the end. While the army was fighting, the Presbyterian majority in Parliament, frightened by the soldiers' radicalism, had resumed negotiations with Charles I. They were ready to make any concessions to reach an agreement with the king and use his authority against the army. For the army leaders, this was the last straw. They saw it as a deal with the devil, a betrayal of everything for which blood had been shed. On December 6, 1648, as the members were returning to Westminster, Colonel Thomas Pride, with a detachment of soldiers, cordoned off the entrance to the House of Commons. He held a list and expelled or arrested all members known for their sympathies towards the king and the negotiations. This military operation went down in history as Pride's Purge. About 140 Presbyterian members were expelled from Parliament. The remaining minority of about 60 or 70 radicals, nicknamed the Rump, was completely under the army's control. The way to the king's trial was open. Cromwell, having returned to London after the final victory, at first apparently hesitated. The idea of trying God's anointed was monstrous, unheard of for that era. It violated all conceivable laws and traditions. But the pressure from the army and his own conviction that Charles was a man of blood, who had to be punished by God's command, prevailed. He came to the conclusion that this was the only possible path, predestined by Providence. The execution of the king became for him not a political act, but the fulfillment of the Almighty's will, a terrible but necessary sacrifice to cleanse the land of shed blood. In January 1649, the Rump established a high court of justice to try the king. The charge was formulated in a revolutionary way. Charles Stuart was accused not of violating specific laws but of high treason, of having maliciously waged war against his people and Parliament. This was the first attempt in history to condemn a monarch in the name of the nation. The trial began on January 20th in Westminster Hall, an ancient hall that had seen coronations and trials for centuries. The atmosphere was tense. King Charles I conducted himself with great dignity and courage. From the very beginning, he refused to recognize the court's legitimacy. "I would know by what power I am called hither," he asked, addressing the judges. "I am your king, bound by a trust. I have a trust committed to me by God by old and lawful descent. I will not betray it to answer to a new unlawful authority." He understood that he was defending not just his life, but the very principle of monarchy. He had turned the defendant's dock into a throne. The judges, among whom were Cromwell, Ireton, and other army leaders and members of Parliament, were disconcerted, but there was no turning back. The trial lasted for several days. Witnesses were heard, confirming the king's part in starting the war. On January 27th, the court delivered its verdict. Charles Stuart, as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the good people of this nation, was sentenced to death by beheading. The death warrant was signed by 59 judges, or regicides as they came to be called. Oliver Cromwell's signature was the third. According to legend, while signing the warrant, he was in a state of nervous excitement, laughing and smearing a neighbor's face with ink. Perhaps it was a way of coping with the colossal psychological stress. The execution was scheduled for January 30th, 1649. The morning of the execution was bitterly cold. Charles asked to wear 2 shirts so that he would not shiver from the cold, and so the crowd would not think he was trembling with fear. He said goodbye to his younger children who remained in England. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he was led out onto a scaffold built outside the banqueting house at Whitehall. A huge crowd filled the square in Sunts. Due to the cordon of soldiers, the king's speech addressed to those on the scaffold was heard by almost no one. He again declared his innocence and said he was dying as a martyr for the people. Then he said a short prayer, laid his head on the block, and gave the signal to the executioner. With one blow of the axe, the head was severed from the body. The executioner's assistant held it up and showed it to the crowd. Instead of the expected joyful cries, according to eyewitnesses, a single long groan rose from the crowd, a groan of horror, shock, and perhaps remorse. The execution of the king was an event that shook all of Europe. It was a point of no return. The monarchical system, which had seemed unshakable and established by God, was destroyed. England became a republic, or, as it was officially called, a commonwealth. But this republic was born in blood and violence, and its future was uncertain. And the man who was most responsible for this act, Oliver Cromwell, now bore the full weight of what had been done. He had destroyed the old order. Now he had to build a new one. The removal of the king brought England neither peace nor stability. The newborn republic or commonwealth found itself in a hostile environment. Monarchical Europe was in shock and horror at the unprecedented act of regicide. In England itself, the royalists were suppressed but not destroyed, and contradictions were growing among the supporters of the revolution. The Leveller movement demanded the immediate implementation of the agreement of the people and the granting of voting rights to the broad masses. Cromwell and other grandees, seeing their ideas as a threat to anarchy and the sacred right of property, brutally suppressed several soldier mutinies, which alienated some of their former supporters. But the main threat came from outside. In Ireland, after Charles I's execution, various factions. Irish Catholic Confederates who had been at war for their rights since 1641 and English Royalist Protestants temporarily forgot their enmity and united against a common enemy, the English Parliament. They proclaimed Charles II, the son of the executed monarch, as their king. Ireland became the main base for a possible royalist invasion of England. At the same time in Scotland, which was shocked by the execution of its Stuart king, the Presbyterians also recognized Charles II as their monarch, albeit on the strict condition of his adherence to the covenant. The Republic was caught in a pincer. It was decided to strike first, and the first target chosen was Ireland. In August 1649, Oliver Cromwell, as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland at the head of a 12,000-strong expeditionary army, landed in Dublin. He went to Ireland not just as a commander, but as an avenger and an instrument of divine justice. For him and his Puritan soldiers, the Irish Catholics were not just enemies, but savages, idolaters, and most importantly, murderers guilty of the massacre of Protestant settlers in 1641. In his eyes, this was not a war, but a punitive expedition. The first target was the well-fortified port town of Drogheda, whose garrison consisted of English royalists and Irish Confederates. Cromwell offered the garrison to surrender, but was refused. After a powerful artillery bombardment that breached the walls, the new model army stormed the town. The defenders offered desperate resistance. When the town was taken, Cromwell gave an order that became the blackest stain on his reputation: to give no quarter. Not only the soldiers of the garrison were slaughtered, but also all men found with weapons, as well as all Catholic priests. Hundreds of people who had taken refuge in St. Peter's Church were burned alive when soldiers set the building on fire. About 3,500 people died. In his report to Parliament, Cromwell wrote without a shadow of a doubt, "I am persuaded that this is a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches who have imbrued their hands in so much innocent blood. I think that it will tend to prevent the effusion of blood for the future, which are the satisfactory grounds to such actions, which otherwise cannot but work remorse and regret." He sincerely believed that this cruelty was justified, as it would save lives in the future by breaking the will to resist. From Drogheda, Cromwell moved south to the town of Wexford. There the story repeated itself, though with some differences. During negotiations for surrender, Cromwell's soldiers broke into the town and carried out a massacre in which about 2,000 soldiers and hundreds of civilians died. The cruelty at Drogheda and Wexford did indeed have its effect. The terror of Cromwell's army made other towns surrender without a fight. In 9 months, Cromwell conquered most of eastern and southern Ireland. In May 1650, he handed over command to his sons-in-law Ireton and Ludlow and returned to England, where a new threat awaited him. The Irish campaign ended in a total defeat for the Irish, mass confiscation of land from Catholics, and its transfer to English soldiers and adventurers. For Ireland, it was a national catastrophe, the memory of which is alive to this day. The threat now came from Scotland. Charles II, seeing the failure of the Royalists in Ireland, accepted the humiliating terms of the Scottish Presbyterians. He arrived in Scotland and reluctantly publicly swore to the covenant, effectively becoming a Presbyterian king. Scotland began to raise an army to invade England for the restoration of the monarchy. The English Parliament decided to act preemptively. The commander-in-chief of the army, Thomas Fairfax, unwilling to invade allied in religion Scotland, resigned. His place was taken by Oliver Cromwell, who became Lord General of all the armed forces of the Commonwealth. In July 1650, Cromwell, at the head of the English army, entered Scotland. The Scottish army was commanded by the experienced General David Leslie. He chose a correct tactic of attrition, avoiding a decisive battle and luring the English deep into his territory, having first created a scorched earth zone. Cromwell's army suffered from disease and lack of provisions. By the end of August, the English were trapped near the coastal town of Dunbar, pinned against the sea by Leslie's army, which was twice as large and occupied the commanding heights. The situation seemed hopeless. Cromwell wrote that he had never felt such pressure. But at the decisive moment, the Scots made a fatal mistake. The Committee of Covenanters, consisting of radical clergy and nobles, not trusting Leslie's professionalism and believing victory was already in their hands, forced him to bring the army down from the impregnable hills to the coastal plain, to finally crush the army of sectaries. Cromwell, observing this maneuver through his spyglass, exclaimed, "The Lord hath delivered them into our hands." On the night of September 3rd, under cover of darkness and rain, he regrouped his forces and launched a surprise attack at dawn. The Scots were caught completely off guard. The Battle of Dunbar turned into a triumph of Cromwell's military genius. His army, though outnumbered, utterly routed the enemy. About 3,000 Scots were killed and 10,000 were taken prisoner. It was a victory that Cromwell, as always, attributed solely to divine intervention. However, the war was not yet over. Charles II, with the remnants of his army, made a desperate move. In the summer of 1651, he invaded England, hoping for a massive royalist uprising. But the English, tired of war, did not support him. Cromwell, leaving part of his forces to complete the conquest of Scotland, gave chase. On September 3rd, 1651, exactly 1 year after Dunbar, the armies of Cromwell and Charles II met at the city of Worcester. It was the last battle of the English Civil War. Cromwell's army, significantly outnumbering the enemy, won a complete and crushing victory. Cromwell himself called it a crowning mercy. Charles II miraculously managed to escape. After 6 weeks of wandering, hiding in the famous Royal Oak and disguised as a servant, he managed to cross to France. By the end of 1651, all of Britain, England, Scotland, and Ireland, was by force of arms united under the rule of the English Parliament. Cromwell returned to London an absolute triumvir, the most powerful man in the country. The wars were over. It was time to build peace, and this task proved to be far more difficult than winning any battle. With the end of the wars, Cromwell and his comrades faced a fundamental question: how to govern the country. Formally, power belonged to the Rump of the Long Parliament. But this was just a fragment of the former representation, devoid of authority and legitimacy in the eyes of the nation. The army, which had won the victory, looked upon the parliamentarians with unconcealed contempt, considering them corrupt and ineffective politicians who were in no hurry to carry out reforms but only to line their own pockets. Cromwell himself became increasingly disillusioned with Parliament. He urged the members to hold new elections and dissolve themselves, but they, fearing to lose power, delayed. Cromwell's patience snapped on April 20th, 1653. It was then that the scene with which we began our story took place. Bursting into Parliament, he dispersed the members with the words, "In the name of God, go!" This act was, in essence, a military coup. All power in the country fell into the hands of Cromwell and the Council of Officers. But Cromwell was not an ordinary dictator lusting for personal power. He was a sincerely religious man who agonizedly sought the best form of government for the country, one pleasing to God. In the summer of 1653, he undertook a unique experiment. Instead of elections, He and his officers themselves appointed a new legislative body of 140 men, selected on the principle of their piety and religious zeal from lists provided by independent churches. This assembly went down in history as the Parliament of Saints, or, after one of its colorful members, a leather seller named Praise God Barebone, the Barebone's Parliament. Cromwell believed that these pious men could build a just society. But the experiment failed spectacularly. The saints proved incapable of constructive work. They split into moderates and radicals who wanted to abolish tithes, reform the common law, and even abolish the universities as hotbeds of sinful secular learning. After 5 months realizing their incompetence, the moderate majority of the Parliament voted to dissolve itself and handed all power back to Oliver Cromwell. The army leaders understood that it was time to end the experiments. The country needed a stable and strong executive power. A group of officers, led by General John Lambert, drafted the first and only written constitution in English history, the Instrument of Government. According to this document, England, Scotland, and Ireland were declared a commonwealth, headed by a Lord Protector for life with broad powers. Legislative power was vested in a unicameral parliament elected on the basis of a high property qualification. Executive power was shared between the Lord Protector and a Council of State, appointed by Parliament. On December 16, 1653, Oliver Cromwell was solemnly proclaimed Lord Protector. The era of the Protectorate began. Cromwell, in essence, became an uncrowned monarch. He moved into the royal palace of Whitehall. He was surrounded by a splendor comparable to a royal court. But his rule was full of contradictions. On the one hand, he sought to heal and pacify the nation after long years of war. He carried out a number of important reforms, put the finances in order, and reorganized the judicial system. In religion, he pursued a policy of relative toleration. The Anglican Church was effectively dissolved, but representatives of various Protestant sects, Independents, Baptists, Quakers, were granted freedom of worship as long as they did not disturb public order. He even allowed the Jews who had been expelled from England in the 13th century to return to the country and establish a synagogue in London. Catholics and Anglicans, however, remained outside the law. On the other hand, his regime was based on military force. The parliaments convened in accordance with the Instrument of Government proved no less obstinate than their predecessors. They challenged the Protector's powers and tried to revise the Constitution. Cromwell had to dissolve them, which made his rule increasingly authoritarian. In 1655, after a series of royalist plots, he took an extreme measure. He divided the country into 11 military districts, each headed by a major general with extraordinary powers. The major generals not only maintained order but also zealously enforced morality, closing alehouses, banning cockfighting, bear baiting, theatrical performances, and other sinful amusements. This regime of Puritan dictatorship made the Protectorate extremely unpopular with the people. Cromwell's foreign policy was much more successful. He sought to revive England's greatness on the international stage and to create a powerful Protestant alliance against the Catholic powers. His reorganized and strengthened fleet, under the command of the brilliant Admiral Robert Blake, won a war against the Dutch, England's main commercial rival. He then launched a war against Spain. England captured the island of Jamaica in the Caribbean from the Spanish, laying the foundation of its colonial empire, and defeated the Spanish Silver Fleet. Cromwell made Europe respect and fear England. In 1657, the Second Parliament of the Protectorate, seeking greater stability and a return to traditional forms of government, offered Cromwell what seemed unthinkable: to accept the title of king. This question tormented him for several weeks. On the one hand, the crown would give his rule legitimacy in the eyes of most Englishmen and ensure continuity. On the other, he himself had fought against the monarchy and executed a king. How could he now wear the crown? Moreover, his old comrades in arms in the army, for whom the word king was synonymous with tyranny, were categorically opposed to this step. After long and agonizing deliberation and prayer, Cromwell refused the crown, declaring, "I cannot undertake this government with the title of king." However, he agreed to a new constitution, the Humble Petition and Advice, which restored a second House of Parliament, the House of Lords, and gave the Protector the right to appoint his successor. His power became even more monarchical in everything but name. He was a de facto king, if not de jure. The last years of Cromwell's life were overshadowed by anxiety and disappointment. He had reached the pinnacle of power he had never dreamed of, but had failed to create the godly and stable order he sought. The regime was held together by his personality and the strength of the army. He was alone at the top. Many old friends and Republican comrades had turned away from him, accusing him of betraying the ideals of the Revolution and usurping power. The country, tired of Puritan strictures and military rule, grumbled. Financial problems grew. Cromwell looked exhausted and aged. The heaviest blow for him was the death of his beloved daughter, Elizabeth Claypole, in the summer of 1658. He was inconsolable. His own health, undermined by years of campaigning and incredible stress, began to decline rapidly. At the end of August, he was struck down by a bout of ague, probably malaria, which he had likely contracted in his youth in the marshy Fens. He died as he had lived, with an unshakable faith in God. He sought comfort in the words of Holy Scripture and asked his chaplain if a man who had once known divine grace could finally fall from it. Receiving a negative answer, he said, "Oh, then I am safe, for I know that I was once in grace." He had no doubt that his soul would be saved. Before his death, he appointed his eldest son, Richard, as his successor. Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector of England, Scotland, and Ireland, passed away in the afternoon of September 3rd, 1658. It was the anniversary of his greatest victories at Dunbar and Worcester. For his supporters, it was a sign of divine recognition. For his enemies, a sign that the devil himself had come for his soul. At the moment of his death, a terrible storm, one of the strongest of that century, broke over London. People whispered that nature was mourning the death of a great man, or that evil spirits were fighting for his soul. He was buried with a splendor exceeding that of any English monarch. His body, embalmed and dressed in royal robes, was displayed for public viewing at Somerset House, and then with a grand procession interred in Westminster Abbey, in the royal necropolis. It seemed that his dynasty was firmly established, but this was an illusion. The system he had created was too closely tied to his personality. His son, Richard Cromwell, was a nice and virtuous man, but possessed neither his father's talents nor his authority. He could not control the army, which once again began to interfere in politics. The Protectorate collapsed in less than a year. Anarchy reigned in the country. In this situation, the elite and the people, tired of chaos, saw only one way out: the restoration of the monarchy. General Monk, who commanded the army in Scotland, marched on London and organized elections for a new parliament, which immediately invited Charles II to return from exile. In May 1660, Charles II, son of the executed king, triumphantly entered London. With the Stuart Restoration began an era of revenge. The surviving regicides were captured and executed in a gruesome manner by being hanged, drawn, and quartered. But the main symbolic revenge was reserved for the dead protector. In January 1661, on the 12th anniversary of Charles I's execution, the bodies of Oliver Cromwell, his son-in-law Henry Ireton, and the judge John Bradshaw were exhumed from their graves in Westminster Abbey. They were dragged on sledges through the streets of London to the execution site at Tyburn. There their corpses were hanged on the gallows until sunset. Then their heads were cut off and the bodies were thrown into a common pit. Cromwell's head was impaled on a long pole and displayed on the roof of Westminster Hall, the very hall where he had tried a king and ruled a country. It remained there for nearly a quarter of a century, a gruesome reminder of the times of the Great Rebellion. So who was Oliver Cromwell? History has never given a single answer to this question. Over the centuries, his image has changed beyond recognition. For royalists and supporters of the monarchy, he was a bloody tyrant, a hypocrite, a usurper who had destroyed the lawful order. For radical Republicans of the 19th century, he became a hero, a fighter for freedom and parliamentary rule, a founding father of British democracy. For the Irish, his name will forever remain synonymous with a cruel conqueror and religious fanatic, responsible for mass murder and national humiliation. He was, without a doubt, a man of deep contradictions. A simple country squire who became one of the greatest military commanders in English history. A pious Puritan who shed rivers of blood. A fighter against the tyranny of one man who became an absolute dictator. A defender of Parliament who dispersed it by force of arms. A regicide who was buried with royal honors. Perhaps the key to understanding Cromwell lies in his unshakable, almost fanatical faith. He sincerely believed that he was an instrument in God's hands. This faith gave him the strength to crush his enemies, to execute a king, and to rule a country. But it also made him blind to the suffering of those he considered enemies of God, and deaf to the arguments of those who saw the world differently. He was a man of his age, brutal, passionate, and religious. He tried to build the kingdom of God on earth as he understood it, but in the end, he built a military dictatorship that his own people rejected, and yet his legacy is immense. Although the monarchy was restored, it was never the same again. The ideas for which the Long Parliament fought, the supremacy of law, the accountability of the king to Parliament, the inalienable rights of subjects, took root in the political consciousness of the nation. The glorious revolution of 1688, which definitively established a constitutional monarchy in England without bloodshed, was in many ways the completion of the work begun in 1640. Cromwell had proved by force of arms that a monarch's power is not absolute, and no English king after him dared to rule without Parliament. He remains one of the most complex, controversial, and influential figures in world history. A man who came from obscurity to overthrow a 1,000-year-old monarchy, to unite Britain by force and to make all of Europe reckon with his will. His shadow still hovers over Britain, a reminder of those turbulent times when a simple gentleman from Huntingdon, guided by faith and the sword, forever changed the course of history. His life was an eternal drama about power, faith, cruelty, and the tragic attempt of a man to build a perfect world on an imperfect earth.